Hi, Paul. Great to see you. How you doing?
And you? Not too bad. Just struggling on with life as one does.
Yeah, as one does indeed. So, no, honestly, thanks for popping in and talking to me. It's always great to see you. And yeah, just before Christmas as well. So yeah, very grateful. I know you're aware that many of our allies of A Disorder for Everyone, Drop the Disorder, MAD in the UK, they're always asking about non-pathologising approaches and responses to emotional distress. And compassion-focused therapy is something that comes up really regularly for us. And that's why we're really excited about you coming back basically to do a workshop for us on 16th of January, which isn't far away now. When I was planning it, seemed like ages in the future, but now it's almost upon us. So what I wondered, Paul, is for people who aren't too familiar with compassion-focused therapy, I wondered if I could ask you to talk briefly just about what it is, and maybe also share a little insight into what to expect from the workshop on the 16th of January.
Many of the mental health difficulties that people have are not chosen. I mean, nobody wakes up in the morning and thinks, you know what, I'm so happy and confident. I think I need to practice having panic attacks. Yeah, I'm going to go on to one of those workshops where you can scare the shit out of yourself. Or I'm so happy. I think I need to create a suicidal depression. Yeah, I think I'll do that. Yeah, that's good. I'm going to practice every day how to be suicidally depressed. Nobody chooses it, okay? These states of mind come on us. We don't want them. So that's very important that we realize that it's not your fault. Whatever state of mind you're experiencing that's causing you pain is not your fault. You didn't choose it. You didn't build the brain that makes you capable of experiencing those things. And very often you haven't chose the background and early life experiences that have really not done you so many good favors. Right, so the next question that you ask then, Joe, is, okay, so given that then, given that we all can fall subject to this horrible dark side of our minds, what can we do? And that's where compassion comes in, because we also have the potential brain states. We can create brain states within us, which has the potential to stand against the dark side. And this has been known for a long time. And it's called compassion. It's not just, I haven't just made it up. It's been around for many thousands of years. I'm so sorry about that. Just let me turn that off. Called the dark side. And compassion is a way in which we can literally notice and train our minds to be helpful. So sorry, I thought I'd taken the phones out. Dark side, see, dark side, there we are. So how do we then begin to bring the issue of compassion into therapy? Well, my area was chronic depression, and I've been working with people who had severe and chronic depressions for a while, and we used a lot of cognitive therapy. Now, cognitive therapy is terrific in many ways, and what it is you help people understand that their thoughts and their feelings tend to be married, so that if you have an anxiety issue, you tend to have anxious thoughts. And anxious thoughts, the more you dwell on anxious thoughts, then the more anxious you become. And this is because our mind and our body and our brain follows what goes on in our mind. A much nicer example would be, if you lay in bed and have a sexual fantasy, what happens in your body? Well, that's interesting, isn't it? But if you think about it, hang on a minute. How can an image that I'm creating on purpose stimulate a very precise set of cells in my brain to make my body respond? How is that possible? Well, once you see that is possible, then it's clear that anything could be an anxiety, it could be an anger, it could be compassion that can stimulate your brain. Okay, so once you get that idea that what's in your mind, what you're thinking about, what you're focusing on can also stimulate your body and your brain, that's very, very important. So when you're doing cognitive therapy, sometimes what happens is you help people identify the ways in which their thoughts and their emotions are chasing each other. So people who are depressed tend to see the world in a depressing way. They have a negative view of themselves, negative view of the future, and a negative view of the world. That was Tim Beck's concept of the triad. And so what you do is you help them stand back and say, okay, well, let's have a look at this. So you think you're a failure, you think you're no good, you think people don't love you, but how would you see this if you weren't depressed? How would a friend talk to you? If you was to have a more balanced view, what parts of your life do you think might have been successful? And so the idea is that when you're doing cognitive therapy, you start to break up the loop between the feeling and the thinking, so they're not driving each other. Okay, so you can begin to experience the feelings, but you're not driving it with this thinking and reflecting and ruminating. So that's great, that works. However, there were some clients which we were doing this with, and they would say, yes, I can understand that. I feel inferior and unlovable, but I suppose in a way I know I'm not. But I just feel I am, or I know I'm not to blame for my abuse, but I just feel, I know I'm not a bad person, but I just feel like I'm a bad person. Do you know what I mean? So these are really quite important. So we had a lady who had been adopted as a young as a baby, she's a very young person, as a baby, and she had this basic belief that she shouldn't have been born, wasn't wanted. It was a very difficult adoption into a difficult family, and but she had a good relationship with her husband and children, and she was able to see that. But when I said to her, so when you focus on the fact that you do have a good relationship with your husband and children, how do you feel? And she says, well, I understand it in my head, but it doesn't really change how I feel. So I asked her to, I wasn't quite sure what to ask her really, but I asked her, how do you hear that in your mind? When you are hearing those alternative thoughts, you're standing back and you recognize, well, actually, no, I have a husband who cares for me. How do you hear them in your mind? And this is what she said. She said, well, as I actually hear them? And I said, yeah. And she said, come on, you're doing cognitive therapy, aren't you? You got a husband who loves you. You got 3 lovely children. For goodness sake, look at the evidence. What have you got to be depressed about? And I thought, oh my God. So I discovered that the hostility was being carried in the emotional challenge, not the cognitive, right? So the idea is, I'm not such a bad person, blah, 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 that's okay. But if you're saying that to yourself with an angry voice, really, come on, blah, 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 that sort of push, then there's no warmth in the system and it's not really going to help you. So the obvious thing, of course, being that I'm an obvious person, was to say, well, okay, well, supposing you was to imagine a really kind voice, a compassionate part of you, helping you understand that, your relationship with your husband has gone well and you've got 3 lovely children, just try and warm up. Let's try and get some kindness and warmth into the way in which you're thinking these thoughts. And that led to the second shock, which was, no, I'm not doing that. I'm absolutely not doing that. No. I've never been kind to myself. I don't think I deserve to be kind to myself. I can't see how this kind, what do you mean kind thoughts? For goodness sake, there must be something stronger, surely? Is that it then? A bit of kindness to yourself. So they really didn't want to do it, right? Very contemptuous, push away. So that was a bit of a shock. So the next thing, which was also a shock, is that when we did start to help individuals begin to engage with compassion, and that required them beginning to engage with the pain that the depression was about, the deep loneliness, the deep sense of being unloved, the deep sense of being unwanted. When you started to get into the pain underneath the depression, that was very, very painful for people. And so what we discovered is that, firstly, a lot of hostility is not always carried in thinking. It can be carried in your emotional feeling towards yourself. Second thing is that people, they push back at compassion because they can't see it's helpful, but they also push back because when they start it doesn't take them into these wonderful places. It will start to reopen trauma. And that's because every motivational system carries its own trauma. For example, if you like going on holidays, Joe, you love holidays, isn't that great? And then one day on a holiday, you get badly beaten up. The chances are the next time you see advertisement for a holiday on the television, you're not going to get in touch with the joy. Oh, holiday, great. You're going to be triggered into trauma. So if you've got trauma in your care system, that's your explorative holiday going system. If you got care in your if you got trauma in your care system, abuse or neglect or being criticized or whatever, all kinds of things that can happen there. When you start to do compassion, that's what you're going to start to run into. So what we discovered, and I'll stop after that I've said this bit, was that we had to detoxify the care system. And we talk a lot about fears, blocks, and resistances to compassion, because a lot of people that we work with that have mental health difficulties, they're actually quite resistant to compassion, actually. They think they don't deserve it, they're ashamed. You know, if you really knew what went on in my mind, you wouldn't think I deserve compassion. Compassion is too weak, it's an indulgence. But in reality, compassion is the most courageous and the wisest of all of our motives. You know, if you think of a firefighter risking their lives to save somebody, I mean, that's the compassion. You know, that compassion, it has immense courage and wisdom to it. Because it takes us into areas of pain and suffering. That's where it takes us. It's not about getting away from pain and suffering. Compassion takes us deep into it to heal it.
Yeah, sure. You talk about compassion being a motivation to address the suffering or alleviate the suffering somehow in a wise way, and obviously that is full of courage.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely right. See, the key thing about courage is without courage, you may know what to do, but you don't do it. I mean, and you think of the courage that people have to, you know, for giving up substance abuse, for example, or having to leave a toxic relationship or whatever. I mean, you know, and you had things in your life which you required a lot of courage for. So courage is an incredibly important part of the engagement with suffering, but we also need wisdom, because courage by itself, if I see somebody fall into a fast flowing river and I think I must save them, so as I jump in, I suddenly remember, oh, but I can't swim. That is reckless. So recklessness, right? Courage without wisdom is reckless. And wisdom without courage is ineffective, because you don't do anything. So you need the two things. You need the courage to engage with the suffering, and many people's lives they've got immense suffering. So you need courage to go in there, but you also need to do it wisely. Otherwise, you can just make things more difficult for yourself and worse. So it's how to engage with a genuine compassion orientation to be helpful.
So if compassion then is, like, I suppose, a combination of courage and wisdom, do you think that it can potentially help us to, like, collectively like challenge a system as well? What is it useful for, kind of collective action or change making in any way?
Well, it's a great question, Joe, because there's just now been set up the Global Compassion Coalition, which is bringing together many people from around the world who are interested in the science of compassion. But how do we create compassion communities? Now, there's somebody called Julian Abel who wrote a wonderful book called The Compassion Project about how to stimulate communities to support each other, to break out, you know, to be aware of the problems of loneliness on the states and so on and so on. And some of the amazing things that happened during COVID, where people really came forward to be as helpful as they could to other people. So one of the things is, how do we stimulate compassion within communities? How do we stimulate compassion within schools? Because, as you know, schools tend to be quite competitive. They're orientating children to compete and to be ranked. But, you know, we've been doing work on specifically doing compassion training in schools, and that's proved to be very helpful to people. How can you bring compassion into business? What would compassion in business look like? And there's increasing research now showing that compassionate businesses that treat their employees compassionately, take an interest in their well-being, those employees are much more loyal and faithful to the company, and they'll go the extra mile, whereas exploitative bosses not so much. So there's a lot of benefits in compassion. The key area that we have at the moment is compassion in politics, because, as you probably know, politics, partly driven by the right-wing media, is really focusing on a lot to do with fear and worries about the other group and jobs in the future. And so there's a lot of fear-generated politics at the moment, and that's pushing people into callousness and away from compassion. As you know, in this country, I'm not going to make a political statement, but I am. We've seen our services just run into the ground. Absolutely. The health service, schools, wherever you look, underfunding, underfunding, underfunding. Why? Because we want to fund the rich tax cuts. This is unsustainable. Unsustainable. If you want to have a compassionate society, you've got to pay for it. And that means that all of us have to take responsibility for ensuring that we get the politicians who are going to build a compassionate society that we want our children to live in and our grandchildren to grow up in, right? You're not going to get that if you keep voting for people who have very little interest in creating compassionate societies. Now, it is obviously true you have to create wealth before you can distribute it. Of course, that's true. So it's not about saying one side or the other, but it is saying that we need to have politicians, business people who are much more focused on how to address the nature of suffering, the causes of suffering. So however we do it, that we have a health service that is, that people can use and works. We have a water service that doesn't push all the profits into shareholders and let our beaches go to rack and ruin. So these are important issues. Compassion is not this soft, weak thing. Let's just be kind to ourselves. It's also a real political force. When you understand it, it's a political force. We will not tolerate the creation of suffering. And when people make that decision, really go for that, we will not tolerate it. The world will change.
Absolutely. No, I think there's those points about it being wider than an individual conversation, much more about politics, community. It's really important. And I think that's largely why the stuff around compassion it really speaks to people who are critical of systems, oppressive systems, and I suppose in particular, from my point of view in organising the workshop with you, it's critical of psychiatry and critical of labelling and all of that stuff, because people have come out of that and they've got compassion, they've got courage, they've got wisdom. So it's resonating on many levels, and I think they want to approach people with more wisdom and courage.
Absolutely, and it's about standing against anything which creates suffering. So if pathologizing creates suffering through shame, then we stand against it.
Yeah. What would you say about the workshop that's going to be happening in January? What would you be just covering what you're talking about, expanding on that? Is there going to be an interactive element? What do you think might happen?
Yes,
what can people expect?
Yes, what we try and do is you do a little bit on the background, we do a little bit more on the basic theory, how the brain works, the link between compassion and attachment, and also we do some practices that people can practice, how to use your body to support your mind, how to use compassionate imagery, how to engage in compassionate behavior, and so on. So there's a little bit of everything for everyone.
Oh, thanks. That's sounds great. I'm really looking forward to it, and it's exciting. So thanks again for stopping by and talking to me today, Paul. I really appreciate it.
It's wonderful what you do, Jo, and thank you for inviting me.
Have a great Christmas, and I'll see you in January.
Okay then, bye-bye.
Okay, cheers. Bye.